production limiting issues is around weaner management. And so I think we should hear from Brent about what his concerns are and what he thinks the limits are. And then we might go from there to Anna and Audrey for some commentary on this subject. So over to you, Brent.
Our sheep do present a few challenges. Yeah, you wonder if you're doing the right thing at times. We actually have a few arguments with Alan, our farm consultant, over our stocking rate. And the compromise or trade-off there is the amount of the amount of feed we grow compared to how clean the pasture is. If we blow out all the grasses, we tend not to have very much feed, so the sheep don't do well. And the same way, if we don't tidy up the grasses, we end up with a dirty crop the next year and don't grow as good a crop. The time management, we seem to be spending a fair bit more time on the sheep than we do the crops, which can make life hard at times. And also the weaner management is another challenge, which Anna will touch on later in the show. Once we take the lambs off mum, they're either growing or dying. And when we get on the header, it's hard to keep an eye on them and keep them growing over those summer months. Basically, just between the three of us, I guess, we had a chat about valuating our barley through using it through the sheep with a live weight gain ratio of 7 kilo intake of the barley. It would convert 1 kilo of live weight. And Alan and I just came up with you'd be making $500 a tonne gross, so an addition of $250 per tonne if you value your barley at that much. So I was just keen to see what the group said about that, Tim, but I suppose you wanted to get to Anna. So where this came from, there is a bit of panic at the moment over the China tariffs on our barley and whether the price of that will tank come harvest time if it's a good season, and also the interest to do with feeding weaners. Yeah, I guess we get most of our feed in around September, October. That's where most of our feed's grown, and it's just hard to keep a young sheep growing, I guess, and in good condition. I reckon that's one of the places where we could get a lot of improvement in our farming, in our sheep enterprise system.
Anna, would you like to talk about the weaner issues that you see over summer in your district? I might just say Anna's the district veterinary officer, or that's the old title given to the departmental vets. She's based at Narrogin and sees a huge range of sheep health issues based from that office.
I had a chat to Brent earlier in the week, or last week, and we talked about weaners and feedlots. Most of the post-weaning issues that I see in the summer are management issues. They're not, they present as disease for their management issues. The commonest of them is, well, probably vitamin E deficiency, sadly, still rears its head every year. And possibly, there's still a message that we need to get out there. But it still relates to two factors. One is having the right quality and quantity of feed on hand to which the animals are pre-accustomed. If you're supplement feeding, they need to know what those supplements are before they get out there, or you put them out with a few elder ewes so that they can learn. And they need 14 to 16% protein, which is pretty high. So, you know, if you're weaning onto green feed, spring feed, you've really got to know what you're doing with your pastures. There's got to be a strong clover base there, otherwise it's just not going to have enough protein. The grasses will give you energy, but they won't give you enough protein, so you've got to have the clovers in the mix. Dry pastures and crop stubbles, depending on how much grain you do leave on the ground, may have enough protein, but they probably don't have enough energy. So it really depends what sort of manifestations we see post weaning. Depends on what time you're weaning them onto and what you're weaning them onto. One of the commoner things I see post weaning, and it's incredibly frustrating, is basically called post weaning wasting syndrome, and we don't know why. They don't do well. The rumen doesn't adjust. They don't metabolize the feed that you provide them, and they fade away. And I strongly suspect that a lot of that element comes from, or a lot of that comes from animals that are preset to do that, to fade, or, you know, just can't adjust because they didn't have the right start as a lamb. And they're the ones in the back of the mob that you just go, oh, why didn't I knock that on the head 6 weeks ago? So it's that tail. The animals that go into weaning as a tail remain a tail. They never catch up. So it's about actually making sure that you don't have that tail even before you take them off mum. So you need to go back a couple of steps. And there is emerging evidence to suggest that what happens to them in utero can actually preset their metabolism and mean that they don't do as well when they hit the ground. So, you know, I think there's a significant research gap there, and there's a few steps back that need to be taken, because there's a lot we don't know about post-weaning wasting syndrome. And as I say, the other big one is vitamin E. Esther, if you want to move on to the next slide. So Brent asked me about putting animals into feedlots. So I've just sort of put together the rules that I have. Feedlotting is hard to do. You know, if you have the opportunity to sell them off pasture to somebody else to do the feedlotting, I mean, I know there's this barley issue in the mix, but it's much easier to sell them and let somebody else worry about it. Barley in a mix for a feedlot is a high risk strategy. Lambs need to have, or weaners need to have, at least 10 to 15% fibre in the diet for rumen, to keep the rumen happy. And there's this element of the type of fibre as well, so they need some long stem fibre in the mix as well. The long stem fibre is what provides the scratch factor, which helps improve rumen development and rumen function. And if you don't have that, you're always going to struggle. So if you're going to use barley, you need to, I think you probably need to have a fairly long, hard think about that. It is a high risk strategy, and you need to know what you're doing. If you're doing things like that, you must make sure that they always have feed in front of them. Don't allow any breaks in feed intake, because that can precipitate all sorts of problems, particularly salmonella, which is present in animals in any mob of sheep. If you look hard enough, you're going to find salmonella. It's there in sheep that are carriers. And stress, including a break in feed intake, can cause them to start shedding, and then you can be in a world of trouble. Vitamin E again. Vaccination. The recommendation from the vaccine manufacturers now is that if it has been more than 6 months since their last vaccine when they go into a feedlot, and this is probably less applicable to weaners going into feedlots, but it certainly is when we talk about opportunistic feedlotting later in the year. If it's been more than 6 months since their last injection, they should get another booster. So that's quite, you know, I'm not even sure that's even on the label on the vaccine insert. We tend to think of 2 injections as lambs, and then they're probably lucky if they get a booster later on, you know, a year later. But it is well worth giving them a pre-entry vaccination. An outbreak of pulpy kidney in a feedlot can be absolutely disastrous. 2% losses are normal. So, you know, keep a written record, keep your numbers, you know where you are. 2%, depending on what size mob of lambs you've got, is actually quite big. That's normal. You can probably shoot for less if you do everything else right. But if you think there's something unusual going on, then talk to us, get me out, get it diagnosed early. Those last 3 things that I've put on the list at the bottom are, aside from vitamin E and shy feeders and acidosis, those last three things are the common ones that kill dozens of weaners. So, you know, if you think you've got either of any of those, then you really need to be on it quickly. That's about all I've got to say about weaners and feedlots. I'm happy to take questions.
Anna, can I ask, can we go back to your early discussion about lambs and that post-weaning period? As the pasture dries off, how often do you think we need to be thinking about vitamin E supplementation? What's your experience there?
Every 6 weeks.
Every 6 weeks.
Every 6 weeks.
And what's that driven by, do you think?
Look, it's driven by multiple factors, and you probably could get away with a little bit less than 6 weeks, a little bit less, a little bit more than 6 weeks. But young animals have a higher metabolic demand for vitamin E because they've got a higher rate of cell division. They're growing. And high grain diets, which weaners have to be on in order to get the protein and the energy that they need, are oxidative in nature. So you need more antioxidants, which is what vitamin E is, basically, to counter effect the free radicals that are produced by grain digestion. There's high levels of omega-3 in green grass, and that is also an antioxidant. So you get two things. Green grass has got vitamin E in it, but you're also getting that omega-3, which also has an antioxidant effect, and obviously that's absent in a dry feed diet. So the demand is just much higher.
Yeah. Lovely thing is that it's really cheap too. So it's not a hard economic decision. It's very cheap to supplement. So it's economically, it's not a difficult decision in that respect. The other point I'd like to just drill down a little bit with you is that we talked earlier in this session about the use of chaff heaps and the body weight benefits that we can obtain from them relative to everyday stubble. Are chaff heaps any more nutritious for weaners, or what do we need to consider there, just to make best use of those chaff heaps?
Yeah, look, I mean, the received wisdom, or the research that's been done, says that they really only got enough value in them to maintain an adult sheep. Now, on your average farm, by the time chaff heaps start to be eaten, there aren't very many dry adult sheep around. They're either growing or they're pregnant. Sheep are cleverer than we think, and I was interested in what Brent said about, or somebody said earlier, about extending the usefulness of, they maintained weight for the first couple of weeks after they started eating through chaff heaps, and then lost weight after that. And I wonder whether they're actually more selective and they're finding the good stuff in the chaff heaps first, because we certainly know that they're capable of doing that in a stubble paddock. They'll go through and eat the grain, then they'll eat the flag leaf, and then they'll start to eat the crappy stuff when they have to. But look, if you do a bulk analysis on a chaff heap, it hasn't got enough energy or protein to grow a weaner or to maintain a pregnant ewe, and you will have to look at lupins as a supplement. But I think we hugely underestimate, and this is another factor with barley, and it comes back to the fibre content of the diet, but we underestimate the value of gut fill on sheep. You can feed a weaner or a ewe, a pregnant or lambing ewe, with a diet that technically has enough protein and energy in it. But if it's not providing her with gut fill and what we call satiety, so they feel full, they'll still walk the paddock. So I think chaff heaps have a very valuable role to play in that. I mean, you're effectively putting out a bale of hay for them. And if you do need to fill them up as well as provide them with enough energy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I had a question too about the vitamin E, if I'm allowed to jump in, please, Tim. You're basically saying the drench is the only way to go then? There's a bit of talk around if you got green hay, you can get away a bit longer, and also the loose mixes with the vitamins in it. Do they do anything?
Yeah, look, green hay does have some vitamin E in it, but even if it looks green on the outside, it will still continue to decline over the course of the season. Loose mixes, so vitamin E declines with sunlight and with heat. So your loose mix, if they're adding vitamin E into it, yes, fresh out of the mill, it'll have pretty good levels of vitamin E, but again, it tends to decline. There are a number of alternative ways. I mean, you can get them in every 6 weeks and you can drench them. That's a pain. Some people out there are putting vitamin E on grain, the liquid vitamin E onto grain. So that's another option. The problem with that is you're not completely sure that every animal's getting its required 1,500 international units or whatever it is, but that's another option. And then saltbush, Tagasassi, all those sorts of things. 1 week on green feed like that will top an animal up for about 6 weeks. So a lot of people will use the saltbush paddocks and just rotate sheep through there on a 6 weekly basis over the summer.
Okay.
We need to be careful here. We've got the global guru on vitamin E sitting with us. That's Haley. And on chat, she says, vitamin E is very heat sensitive, so it can be easily compromised before given. So that's a little tip from Haley. But Haley, since you're listening in, any other comments that we've missed of key management tips with vitamin E?
Thanks, Tim. We have done some feedlotting work with saltbush and vitamin E injections prior to feedlotting with weaners. And what we found is that the injections didn't last quite as long as we thought they would. And the vitamin E from the saltbush seemed to get them through a 6 week feedlotting period better. And the reason we think that is simply because it wasn't just one form of vitamin E, it's a bit more complex than that. So you're getting other antioxidants as well as the straight alpha TAPU. So yeah, it's not just sometimes the supplements, there isn't a lot of active vitamin E, but just be aware of how much active vitamin E, how hot it's been, how long it's been stored, and all of those sorts of issues. Any green plant in autumn will help with your vitamin E. And if you're feeding a lot of grains, cereal grains, you're going to drive down your vitamin E levels much faster in your stock. So be aware of that as well if you're feeding cereals in the feedlot. But yeah, saltbush is a good option if it fits on your marginal land.
That's great, Harley. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to pick up on something else that Anna talked about, and that was this fading weaner syndrome. Amongst the producers, does anyone feed lupins to their lambs whilst they're still on their mums? It's called blueprinting, I suppose, where you introduce them to grain so that they are well adapted and know what lupins are in the post-weaning period. Does anyone do that? And do you think that from a nutritional perspective and a weaner survival perspective that this blueprinting would have value? And if so, how might we better exploit it?
Yes, absolutely, it does. Anything that gets them eating, straight away after they're weaned. So yeah, having them pre-accustomed makes a big difference. In terms of maximising the benefit or exploiting it, I do know a couple of producers who are using a sort of hybrid. I don't know if people are aware of what's called creep feeding, which is where you set up a system where only the lamb can access the feed. You can do a sort of hybrid of pre-accustoming them to the feed and creep feeding, whereby there's some lupins outside the creep and there's some in, so the ewes introduce them to it, and then the poor buggers don't actually get the bulk of the lupins, so you're not wasting lupins basically on a ewe that's got an almost weaned lamb. So that's quite a good way of sort of cutting your costs a bit, really, rather than anything else, or certainly of maximising the benefits. Beyond that, in my experience, or experience of people I deal with, it works really well with lupins. It doesn't work as well with other grains. They're just much less easily findable and obvious. Maybe they're, old ewes definitely know what they are and they think they're the best thing since sliced bread. So it doesn't tend to work as well with other grains. But yeah, I do quite like the hybrid between creep and blueprinting.
And that's a great point about creep feeding, and it can be very simple too. I've seen gates with vertical slats that simply discriminate between the adult and the lamb purely on size, and that seems to work quite well. But there are other ways of doing it as well, like a hot wire at the right height and so on. Now, amongst us, we have Audrey, who has much younger lambs than Brent. And by way of contrast, I wonder, Audrey, if you could comment about how you go about managing smaller lambs going into summer. Just as a bit further background, I think, Brent, you're a May, June lammer.
Yes, that's right. That's correct.
And Audrey's July. So naturally, Audrey's lambs would be several kilos lighter and 2 months younger when they're going into summer. Audrey, how do you get on with managing weaners to survive and thrive over those summer months? What's your approach?
Well, this is our first year, Tim, of putting back our lambing. So we have yet to see if our plans will survive the challenge. But yeah, basically we've brought lupins back into our cropping system. We haven't grown lupins. We've brought lupins in. We have so we've got a couple of paddocks of lupins that the lambs will be going on. But we also have some multi-species fodder paddocks that we also will be utilising for weaning the lambs on, which do have a vetch and been undersown with clover. So although we will have lighter lambs going into summer, some of those will be crossbred or terminal, crossy lambs, and other ones will be merinos. The hope is to weigh them as they come off the marking cradle, so we'll be able to get a lot better a handle on some of the growth rates. Where we were earlier lambing, we did lamb March, April for our prime lambs, and the merinos were lambing May and June. I guess what we're also hoping by shifting the lambing back is that we will get better growth rates overall. Obviously, the last 2 years have been pretty tough. Sup feeding for such a long period of time resulted in a very high supplementary feeding cost, which was one of the prime reasons for shifting the lambing back. So if we can get better growth rates from the lambs, because they are lambing on these fodder crops, cover crops, and paddocks, pasture paddocks that we've seeded our cereal into, I think we can probably have better growth rates and hopefully not see the real light lambs, which perhaps we might have seen without the better quality of biomass that they were lambing and weaning onto. So yeah, that's the plan at the stage.
And a question to you and to everybody: who is monitoring weaners in terms of live weight change over the summer? And do you think it is it a useful tool?
It's a very important thing to not only weigh them, but also to run your hand over them. We do weigh at weaning time, and then I try and weigh again sort of February to get an idea of how they're going. But yeah, I think it's just something that you've got to do and take off those tail end ones and give them extra care. I
just wondered if Anna had a number in the back of her mind that could give us a reasonable target to achieve in terms of lamb weight gain over summer that didn't send us all broke.
I'm not the expert on those sorts of parameters, or others may be better qualified. I can tell you when they're sick and they're not doing well, but I'm not sure what your target is, to be honest.
Alan, have you got a number?
Oh, well, yeah, look, they should be growing at least 100 grams a day.
Right, okay.
So over 100 days, they should put on 10 kilos minimum, and preferably be better if they were doing 150 grams a day.
Right. And I don't want to embarrass anyone. Does anyone know whether their sheep are actually gaining that sort of, their weaners are gaining that sort of weight over summertime? It is just a set of scales, yeah. But we don't do it. We know the numbers, and I did it this year for I have a son at home with me now. We used the scales as a learning tool for him, and guess who did the most learning? It was me. Mainly because he sorted out all the electronic issues and we actually got some data out. So yeah, it was a fantastic exercise, and I can't recommend it enough. So anyhow, let's have a quick open forum. Are there any other burning questions that people have? We've had limited time to ask people questions, and we've had a lot of very good input from experts, but are there questions that people would like to ask?
Just one for Anna. She said losses of 2% for weaners in a feedlot. I was just wondering what's realistic in the paddock. What should you expect?
In theory, it should be less because you've got a more extensive system. But I suspect for most people, it's pretty similar.
Yep. Okay.
And can I ask a question of Anna as well? With the vitamin E, and I saw Sonja's asked a question about the visual symptoms. Is it similar to lupinosis, perhaps, the symptoms in weaners? You know, when you start to muster them and they just get the wobbles up and all that sort of thing. Is it easy? Do you need to get a vet to come out and check?
Look, one of the what you tend to see, and in feedlots, you very often see ill thrift. And that's basically because the muscle, what it does is affect the large active muscles of the body first. Occasionally they'll just drop dead because it affects the heart muscle. What I see most commonly, what most people see is damage to the large muscles of the back legs. So you'll see ill thrift in feedlots because things hurt and they just don't get up and go to the feeder. In paddock situations, you'll see, and once you've sort of got your eye in, it's quite characteristic, but you see these animals at the back of the mob, they're often losing weight because they're not moving around, but they walk with a very stiff-legged gait, a sort of symmetrical lameness in both back legs, and they'll drop to the back. Hayley's quite right in that they'll often drop to the ground if you keep pushing them. And yes, you can make the diagnosis very easily with a blood test or from the muscle changes at post-mortem if you get to that point. So you end up with a sort of impression of stiffness and skinniness, but I mean, you quite often see stiff, skinny weaners for other reasons, but it is quite characteristic once you've got your eye in for it. I don't know if Hayley would agree with me on that one. Yes, so can I make a comment?
Yeah.
I've actually written something in the chat, but I'd actually love to get some, and we sort of talked about ground truthing. I'd love to get some feedback from people who, like yourselves in this group. When I first started drawing up my PowerPoint, so much of what I see are things that in theory are should be eliminated by good management, so we're told. Pregtox and hypercal are the classics. And yet I see producers with them every year. And I'd love to get feedback from guys like the ones in this group who are up to date with all the best stuff. And if they're doing all the right things and they're still seeing these diseases, then we have a knowledge gap there somewhere, and it would be really nice to get some feedback. Hypocalcemia is the one that does my head in, milk fever, because I see so many people who in theory are doing the right thing and yet the ewes are still falling over. So.
Thanks, Anna. We certainly, I took it on board from your PowerPoint. I know you didn't talk to that slide, but I certainly didn't miss it. And yes, we as vets know we think we know all the epidemiology of it, but there's being able to predict when we're most at risk is still quite elusive. And yes, I hear you loud and clear.